Hi, Amy. So let's start with the big question. Who is a journalist?
The question of who is a journalist is probably one of the more important questions that's happening today in journalism. It hasn't really been answered, but anyone is a journalist, essentially. So anyone producing content, anybody, there's kind of two schools of thought, I would say. One is that the journalists are the traditional print journalists that work for an organization, a newspaper, broadcasting station, and the other kind of school of thought is that a journalist is anyone who publishes content. So the question hasn't really been resolved, but it depends upon what perspective you come from. Yeah.
So we have some new forms of people who are providing content on the internet. So we have bloggers, we have vloggers, we have YouTubers. Can you tell us more about them?
Sure. Bloggers are people who blog on the internet, and vloggers are people who make videos for the internet. They're not professionally trained journalists. They're usually just regular members of the public that can just produce content and put it up online. Yeah.
And should we consider them as people who are providing content, and should we trust them?
I think that's one of the main issues that's being considered today. So I think there is an issue of public trust when it comes to where you're getting your content from, and whether or not the content has been produced by a professional journalist versus who has presumably gone to journalism school or has had some kind of editorial training in the newsroom, versus the content that's produced by the average citizen. There's no reason to think that the average citizen couldn't produce reliable content, but there's also no obligation for that citizen to use the same process of fact-checking and verification that journalists are typically required to go through. So there's a question about trust in terms of the audience and what kind of content that they can use that's trustworthy. But more and more news organizations today are using content produced by citizens that they provide video from on-the-spot events. All sorts of news organizations, from the very top, CNN and The Guardian, to even smaller organizations that you see and local news stations are using citizen content. So I think the challenge for those organizations is to verify the accuracy of that content, and that puts an extra layer of work on these organizations, but the use of the content enables those organizations to cover events all over the world that they would not normally be able to cover, or in spots that they wouldn't be able to cover because they have no resources to put reporters all over the world.
Yeah. So, as you said, it gives us a lot. The digital environment, it gives us a lot because we can have a content from all over the world. And then there is a question of what happens if you publish something that is not truth or it's not verified in a proper way. So who should be responsible after you publish something and then you are correcting it and retracting it after publication?
Well, I mean, legally, the news organization is responsible. So that whether or not that happens, the process happens before publication or after. So the content has to be accurate and correct. One of the challenges, I think, is especially with smaller, shrinking newsrooms that have fewer, smaller resources to work with. One of the challenges is how to verify and fact check, information coming from untrained journalists, video material or other material that untrained journalists send to news organizations and news organizations use. So if you're a very established news organization with a lot of money like The Guardian, you have more resources to fact check. although even The Guardian makes mistakes with that. But if you're a smaller news organization, I think you would take higher risks in terms of using content that has not been verified by the news organization, video content or other information. So that's a decision that smaller organizations have to make, whether or not they have the resources to fact check the information.
Yeah. And when we talk about the defamation, so we have a right to freedom of expression, and then sometimes it can collide with some content that is published. It violates other person's rights. So defamation is, I would say, the most common thing that happens while publishing news or publishing any kind of the content on the internet. So tell us more about the defamation.
Defamation is, the laws vary, across Europe according to what can and can't be, what is considered defamation, although, what's common to them all is that defamation is considered a false statement. And you'll see in places like in Hungary, for instance, the government actively uses defamation laws to respond to criticism that different public officials face. When journalists publish what are generally just basic run-of-the-mill investigative stories about public officials, there's a very common response, which is to file a defamation suit. So defamation laws can be, there's legitimate reasons for these laws where people are trying to protect their own reputation. There's also a trend among especially political elites and business elites to use defamation laws to curb critical speech or reporting about them. So they can be quite repressive from a freedom of expression standpoint. And it depends, of course, if the defamation law is criminal or civil. So most in Central or in Hungary, the laws are criminal.
The trend in Europe is that the defamation should be decriminalized. Do you know how the countries are coping with that?
It's interesting. So there's a movement to decriminalize defamation laws across Europe. Some of those laws have been on the books in countries that haven't applied them, in many years. But in general, even civil defamation laws can be quite restrictive, and the punishments can be extremely high. So, the fines can shut down a news organization. So, I mean, the approach should be even lighter. So it's not necessarily that if you eliminate criminal defamation laws that somehow the problem will be resolved. So civil defamation is still quite a problem, especially when the fines are in the hundreds of thousands of euros. And the fines can also be applied not only to the news organization, but also to the individual journalists and editors. So that scenario puts a lot of pressure on newsrooms to make sure that every single word they write is accurate, which is, of course, what journalists should be doing. But in some cases, you don't always get it 100% correct. In Hungary, for instance, one of the main, challenges for journalists is to make sure that nothing that they publish could be perceived as defamatory. And in the newsrooms that where I know journalists that are working, it's one of the main things that they do before publishing is to kind of go back over everything and make sure that there's no room for a defamation claim. And it does absolutely have a chilling effect on the content, because people are pulling back any content that could be possibly deemed defamatory.
Because everything is going so fast, so how do you balance, you need to publish it and you didn't have time maybe to fact check it or to double check it, and then you are going out.
Well, I mean, the challenge for journalists has always been getting it fast or getting it right. And that challenge is even more important now with the ability to publish at any time. So I think, those are the decisions that, whether you're a big news organization or whether you're, an NGO or have just a website, those are decisions that you just have to make individually about the compromise between speed and accuracy. But I mean, the quality journalism comes from looking more at the accuracy versus the speed. So you'll notice, when there's gang reporting on certain, events, certain news organizations are much slower to put out pieces. The New York Times is classically quite slow. While other news organizations are pushing out, stories, the New York Times is going to hold back sometimes and wait until they verify. That's a editorial decision that newsrooms make.
Okay. And at the end, we are all on the internet as persons, and we provide a lot of content. It depends from person to the person, so we are all in the public eye. How does it influence on every specific person, and how does it smaller our private and intimate area?
So you mean how the internet has basically put all of our lives in the
Yes.
public spotlight? Yeah. Okay, so right. The internet has kind of blurred the lines between public and private lives, so people are more used to putting what would be very private details about either their day or their life on a platform like Facebook, which is essentially like publishing these announcements in a newspaper. And maybe some members of the public don't realize that it is the equivalent of publishing that kind of information or going to a public square and announcing it. So I think there's in some ways an expectation of privacy when using these kinds of platforms, but in fact, when you're publishing that kind of content, it is the equivalent of saying it in a public forum. But this has certainly blurred the lines between the public and private space.